June 6, 1942, shortly after 9 a.m., London. Inside the Admiralty, naval staff officers are reviewing overnight signal traffic arriving from Washington and Honolulu. The reports are incomplete, uneven in detail, and marked by uncertainty. They indicate that a major carrier battle has taken place northwest of Hawaii, and that several Japanese aircraft carriers may have been sunk or disabled. For Britain's wartime leadership still reeling from catastrophe in Asia, the information is difficult to absorb and even harder to trust. Only 6 months earlier, Japanese forces had destroyed British naval prestige in a matter of days. The sinking of Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya in December 1941 had exposed the vulnerability of capital ships to air power. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 had delivered a psychological blow that spread across the empire. Nearly 80,000 Allied troops had gone into captivity. The Japanese advance had seemed relentless, methodical, and unstoppable. Against that background, any report of Japanese defeat was instinctively treated with caution. Winston Churchill receives the first summaries later that morning. As Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, he has spent months confronting a strategic reality in which Britain is no longer the dominant naval power in the Pacific. He understands that this battle, whatever its outcome, was fought almost entirely by American forces. Yet he also knows that the direction of the war against Japan will shape Britain's survival as a global power. The reports crossing his desk suggest that 4 Japanese fleet carriers may have been lost. Churchill does not react publicly. Privately, he demands confirmation. At the Admiralty, First Sea Lord Dudley Pound shares that restraint. Pound has spent the early months of 1942 managing disasters rather than victories. British naval resources are stretched thin across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Arctic. The Royal Navy has already been forced into retreat east of Suez. If Japan has truly suffered a carrier defeat of this scale, it would represent something unprecedented since the war began. But Pound has learned through experience that early battlefield reports are often wrong. British intelligence officers begin cross-checking American signals intelligence with their own assessments. Intercepts indicate a sudden break in Japanese naval radio traffic patterns. Reconnaissance reports from the Pacific begin to align. Slowly, the outline becomes clearer. The Japanese have lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Hundreds of experienced aviators are missing. The Japanese carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor has been shattered in 4 days. Even as the facts solidify, British leaders resist celebration. The lesson of recent months has been that optimism can be dangerous. Singapore had been considered impregnable until the moment it fell. Hong Kong had been written off as a sacrifice, yet its defenders had held longer than expected and paid dearly. In the Pacific, Britain has learned that distance, logistics, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition or courage alone. Churchill understands this at a strategic level. He knows that Midway does not reverse British fortunes overnight. The Royal Navy does not suddenly regain freedom of movement in the Indian Ocean. British prisoners remain in Japanese camps. Burma is still under occupation. Australia remains exposed. Midway changes the balance of initiative, but it does not end the threat. Within Whitehall, discussion turns toward interpretation rather than triumph. What matters most is not simply that Japan has lost ships, but how it has lost them. The Japanese have been defeated in a carrier battle fought at long range, decided by air power, intelligence, and timing. For British naval planners, this confirms lessons learned painfully since 1941. Battleships are no longer the decisive instruments of sea control. Aircraft carriers and trained air crews now determine outcomes. There is also an unspoken psychological shift. Since December, British leaders have struggled against a growing belief that Japan possessed an inherent advantage in naval aviation and fighting spirit. Midway disrupts that belief. The Japanese have shown vulnerability. They have made operational errors. They have lost irreplaceable personnel. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the enemy appears human rather than inevitable. Yet restraint governs every conclusion. Churchill cautions his advisers that Germany remains the primary enemy. The Atlantic War continues to threaten Britain's lifeline. American attention, he knows, cannot be allowed to drift entirely toward the Pacific. Midway strengthens the Allied position, but it also reinforces Britain's dependence on American power. The victory belongs to the United States Navy, not to Britain. By the evening of June 6th, consensus begins to form. Japan has suffered a defeat from which it will not easily recover, but British leaders frame it not as collapse, but as a turning point whose effects will unfold slowly. There is no expectation of immediate Japanese retreat, no illusion that the war in Asia will end soon. Experience has taught them to measure progress in years, not days. As night falls over London, the city remains under blackout. The war feels no closer to ending, but within the quiet rooms of British command, something has shifted. For the first time since the Pacific War began, the direction of momentum no longer points only one way. The question that lingers is not whether Japan has been hurt, but whether Britain will still be strong enough to matter when the long consequences of Midway finally arrive. In the weeks following the Battle of Midway, British intelligence assessments become more precise, and with clarity comes discomfort. Inside Whitehall and the Admiralty, officers review detailed breakdowns of Japanese losses: 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of aircraft gone, and many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators killed. These figures challenge assumptions that had hardened over decades of imperial rivalry and war. The enemy Britain thought it understood now appears different, and that realization forces a recalibration that is as psychological as it is strategic. Before the war, British planners had viewed Japan through a mixture of condescension and anxiety. On paper, Japanese industry was smaller, its access to raw materials limited, and its population perceived through racialized theories common to the era. Yet battlefield experience since December 1941 had overturned complacency. Japanese forces had shown coordination, discipline, and operational daring. Their naval aviation had struck with speed and accuracy. British defeats had bred a counter-myth that Japan possessed a unique aptitude for carrier warfare and an inexhaustible pool of skilled air crews. Midway disrupts both narratives. Intelligence reports make clear that Japan's carrier force was not only vulnerable, but brittle. The loss of trained pilots stands out as especially damaging. British naval analysts understand training pipelines. They know how long it takes to produce competent carrier aviators and how quickly experience is lost when instructors and veterans are killed in combat. Japan's pre-war system had emphasized quality over quantity. At Midway, that quality had been burned away in a matter of hours. Dudley Pound absorbs these findings with a mix of professional recognition and personal weight. As First Sea Lord, he has presided over an era in which British naval supremacy has steadily eroded. Midway does not restore that supremacy, but it confirms that Japan's apparent momentum rested on fragile foundations. The Japanese Navy has taken risks it cannot easily recover from. It has committed its elite assets in a single gamble and lost them. For Winston Churchill, the reassessment is more complicated. He has long warned against underestimating Japan, even while navigating an imperial culture steeped in prejudice. Now he sees the opposite danger, overcorrecting into exaggerated confidence. In private communications, he urges balance. Japan has been checked, not defeated. Its army remains powerful, its occupied territories vast. British forces in Asia are still on the defensive. Yet the internal language begins to change. Briefing papers no longer describe Japanese naval air power as mysterious or inherently superior. Instead, they emphasize doctrine, logistics, and decision-making. Errors at Midway are dissected. Japanese carriers were caught with aircraft rearming. Defensive patrols were inadequate. Intelligence failures compounded operational rigidity. These are not cultural traits. They are professional mistakes. This shift matters deeply. For months, British defeats had carried an unspoken moral burden. If Japan's success was rooted in something immutable, then recovery would be slow and uncertain. Midway restores a sense of rationality to the conflict. Wars are won and lost through decisions, preparation, and resources. Japan's losses are not acts of chance. They are the result of choices. At the same time, British leaders confront their own past misjudgments. The fall of Singapore is revisited not as an unavoidable disaster, but as a failure of planning and imagination. Assumptions about enemy capability had shaped defenses, training, and deployment. The realization that Japan could lose catastrophically forces an uncomfortable parallel. Britain's defeats were not inevitable either. Strategically, this reframing influences how British leaders view Allied cooperation. The American victory at Midway is acknowledged as the product of intelligence integration, carrier doctrine, and decisive command. British officers study these elements closely. They see a model of modern naval warfare that Britain must adapt to, even if it cannot replicate it at scale. Emotionally, the shift is quieter. There are no speeches announcing newfound confidence. Instead, there is a gradual easing of the fatalism that had settled in since early 1942. Reports from Asia remain grim, but they are no longer read with the same sense of helpless inevitability. The enemy is formidable, but no longer inscrutable. By late summer, internal assessments describe Japan as having lost the strategic initiative. This phrase carries weight. It does not imply collapse, but it marks a boundary. Japan will now be reacting more than shaping events. For British leaders, this offers a measure of psychological relief even as material constraints persist. The rewriting of the enemy is not an act of propaganda. It is an adjustment grounded in evidence, forged in loss, and restrained by experience. Midway has not restored confidence, it has restored proportion. And in a war defined by extremes, proportion itself becomes a form of quiet strength. As the implications of Midway settle into British strategic planning, optimism is quickly bounded by reality. Inside the Admiralty and the War Cabinet, assessments focus not on what Japan has lost, but on what Britain can actually do. The answer, measured honestly, is very little in the short term. The British Empire is still fighting a global war with finite resources, and the Pacific remains a secondary theater by necessity, rather than choice. Dudley Pound oversees a navy stretched to its limits. Escort vessels are desperately needed in the Atlantic to counter German submarines. Capital ships are committed to guarding convoys, supporting operations in the Mediterranean, and maintaining pressure on Axis supply lines. The Indian Ocean Fleet, battered earlier in the year, is rebuilding but not yet capable of confronting Japanese forces directly. Midway has reduced Japanese carrier strength, but it has not created an opening that Britain can exploit on its own. This constraint shapes every interpretation. British leaders recognize that the strategic initiative has shifted toward the Allies, yet they also understand that this initiative will be exercised primarily by the United States. American shipyards are producing carriers and aircraft at a pace Britain cannot match. American naval aviation training programs are expanding rapidly. The center of gravity in the Pacific War has moved decisively westward, away from London. Winston Churchill accepts this reality with mixed resolve. He values Britain's alliance with the United States as essential to survival, yet he remains acutely aware of what dependence implies. Midway confirms that the defeat of Japan will be an American-led campaign. Britain's role will be supportive, complementary, and often indirect. This is not a failure of will, but a consequence of scale. British planners therefore shift focus toward preservation and positioning. Holding India becomes paramount. Securing supply routes through the Indian Ocean is essential. Support for China, though limited, remains politically important. The defense of Australia and New Zealand is discussed largely in terms of American capability, with British assistance constrained to what can be spared without jeopardizing the European war. Midway also influences internal debates about priorities. Some voices argue that Japan's losses create an opportunity to reassert British influence in Southeast Asia. Others counter that any premature diversion of resources would weaken the fight against Germany, the enemy still capable of threatening Britain's homeland. The latter view prevails. Germany remains the primary adversary, and nothing at Midway changes that fundamental calculus. This does not diminish the battle's importance. Instead, it reframes it. For Britain, Midway is not a call to advance, but a signal to endure. Time now appears to be working against Japan. British leaders understand attrition. They have lived through it since 1939. If Japan has indeed sacrificed irreplaceable assets, then patience becomes a strategic asset. Within this framework, British intelligence continues to monitor Japanese movements closely. Reduced carrier activity is noted. Defensive postures become more apparent. These observations reinforce the belief that Japan has lost flexibility. Yet caution persists. A wounded adversary can still strike effectively, especially against exposed positions. Emotionally, this period is marked by restraint. There is relief that the Japanese advance has been checked, but also frustration at Britain's limited ability to influence events. Pride, once tied to naval dominance, now must coexist with partnership. For a generation of officers raised on the assumption of maritime supremacy, this adjustment is difficult but unavoidable. Churchill's private correspondence reflects this tension. He speaks of Midway as a turning point, while emphasizing unity and discipline. Public statements remain measured. There is no attempt to claim credit or exaggerate British involvement. The victory belongs to the Allies collectively, but its execution and momentum are American. By late 1942, British strategy toward Japan settles into a posture of guarded confidence. The enemy is weakening, but Britain's strength lies in endurance rather than initiative. The empire will hold where it must, assist where it can, and prepare for a future phase of the war in which its role may again expand. Midway has altered the strategic landscape, but not Britain's immediate position within it. The war continues, defined by limits as much as possibilities. And within those limits, British leaders measure progress not by victories seized, but by disasters avoided. By the end of 1942, British leaders are no longer debating whether Midway mattered. The question has shifted to what its meaning demands of them. Inside Whitehall, assessments now speak plainly. Japan has lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. Its ability to choose the time and place of major naval operations has been reduced. Yet this recognition is handled with care. Public confidence must be restrained because memory is still raw and the cost of error remains visible across Asia. Winston Churchill understands the danger of premature confidence. He has seen how swiftly certainty collapses into disaster. Singapore is never far from his thoughts. The loss was not only military, but moral. It exposed failures of leadership, planning, and judgment that cannot be erased by an American victory thousands of miles away. Midway offers reassurance, but it also sharpens the contrast between what might have been and what was lost. In private discussions, British leaders revisit the months before Japan's advance. Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore are examined again, not to assign blame publicly, but to understand how assumptions shaped outcomes. Japan's success had been enabled by Allied disbelief in its operational reach and resolve. Now, Japan's defeat at Midway reinforces the opposite lesson. No enemy is beyond error, and no advantage is permanent. This reckoning carries a human weight. Reports continue to arrive about conditions in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. British soldiers captured during the early defeats endure forced labor, malnutrition, and abuse. Civilians in occupied territories face repression and scarcity. These realities temper any sense of vindication. Japan's weakening does not ease the suffering already inflicted. Dudley Pound, whose health is failing, carries these burdens heavily. As First Sea Lord, he has been responsible for a navy forced into retreat in regions once considered secure. Midway offers professional validation of naval air power doctrines Britain had begun to adopt but lacked resources to fully implement. Yet there is little satisfaction in being proven right when the cost of delay has been measured in lives. Strategically, British optimism remains conditional. Japan's losses have slowed its expansion, but its defensive perimeter still stretches across vast distances. Reclaiming lost territory will take time, coordination, and sacrifice. British forces in Burma and India remain engaged in hard fighting. The enemy is weakened but not exhausted. Churchill balances these realities carefully in public messaging. He speaks of steady progress and shared Allied purpose rather than decisive turning points. The British public, weary from years of war, is offered reassurance without illusion. Victory is possible, but not imminent. The discipline of patience, he knows, is as important as courage. Midway also deepens Britain's awareness of its changing place in the world. The Pacific War is now clearly an American-driven campaign. British influence will return later, but not on the terms once assumed. This realization is not framed as loss alone, but as adaptation. Survival has always required adjustment, and the Empire's future will depend on learning from both defeat and restraint. Emotionally, the period is marked by quiet steadiness rather than celebration. Confidence grows slowly, rooted in evidence rather than hope. The enemy has been checked, and time favors the Allies, but every gain is measured against what has already been endured. As 1943 begins, British leaders look eastward with clearer eyes. They see an enemy no longer advancing unchecked and an Allied coalition growing in strength. Yet they also see the long road ahead and the moral responsibility carried by those who lead. Midway has changed the war's direction, but it has not erased its cost. That cost remains present, demanding humility as much as resolve. As the war progresses through 1943 and into 1944, British leaders increasingly view Midway not as an isolated victory, but as the first clear marker of Japan's long decline. This understanding develops gradually, shaped by subsequent campaigns and accumulating evidence. Each Japanese setback reinforces what Midway first revealed. Japan's capacity to recover from major naval losses is limited, and its margin for error is shrinking. Within British strategic circles, this perspective becomes institutional. Reports from the Pacific describe a pattern of Japanese responses that are increasingly defensive and reactive. Carrier groups operate with caution. Aircrew quality declines as training pipelines struggle to replace losses. British naval analysts track these developments carefully, seeing in them confirmation that the balance of power has shifted permanently. Winston Churchill reflects on this evolution with characteristic historical awareness. He recognizes that Midway will one day be understood as a hinge point, but not because it ended the war. Rather, it exposed structural weakness with sober clarity. Japan's collapse is now visible in every dimension, military, economic, and moral. Yet there is little appetite for triumphalism. The memory of early defeat tempers satisfaction. The suffering of prisoners and civilians, endured long after Midway, remains a moral weight that victory cannot erase. Churchill, reflecting near the war's conclusion, understands that Britain's role in the Pacific conflict has been one of adaptation rather than dominance. Midway did not restore British power, but it preserved British relevance within a coalition that ultimately prevailed. The judgment exercised in 1942, cautious and restrained, helped maintain unity at a moment when rivalry could have fractured the alliance. In post-war assessments, British historians and officers return repeatedly to the summer of 1942. They note how quickly assumptions fell away under pressure and how essential it was to interpret victory without illusion. Midway is remembered not for spectacle, but for what it revealed about modern war, that outcomes are shaped by systems, preparation, and decision-making over time. For Britain, this lesson carries enduring significance. The empire that entered the war confident in its traditions emerges changed, more aware of limits and dependencies. Weaknesses that could not be corrected under wartime pressure. Japan's industrial base, its fuel supply, and its training systems were all strained beyond sustainable limits. Once that strain was revealed, the outcome became a matter of time. For Britain, the long view of Japan's collapse also intersects with imperial reality. As Allied forces advance across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, plans for post-war governance take shape. British leaders understand that reclaiming territory will not restore pre-war conditions. The authority lost in early 1942 cannot simply be reasserted. Midway, by shifting initiative to the United States, has indirectly accelerated changes Britain cannot fully control. Dudley Pound does not live to see the war's end. His death in October 1943 closes a chapter of British naval leadership defined by endurance under strain. Yet the principles confirmed during his tenure endure. The centrality of air power, the importance of intelligence, and the limits of surface fleets without carrier support become permanent lessons. Midway stands as the moment these truths became undeniable. As victory approaches in 1945, British leaders assess the Pacific War with Midway stands as one of the moments when that awareness sharpened, forcing leaders to confront reality without retreating into nostalgia. The collapse of Japan, when it finally comes, is not sudden. It unfolds through a series of defeats, shortages, and strategic reversals. Yet its beginning can be traced back to those days in June 1942, when British leaders first understood that the enemy's advance had reached its limit. That understanding did not bring immediate relief, but it offered something equally valuable: clarity. And in a war defined by uncertainty, clarity becomes a form of quiet resolve. If you found this documentary valuable, subscribe to continue exploring the untold decisions that shaped the Second World War.